From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Welcome back, Rendezvous with History listeners. As always, I'm your host, Anthony Eames. Today, I'm joined with Stephan Kieninger, fellow of the American-German Institute and author of a forthcoming book, an important book given the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. That book, Securing Peace in Europe, Strobe Talbott, NATO, and Russia After the Cold War, out in September 2025 with Columbia University Press. Stephan, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you to the Reagan Institute for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Well, Stephan, we have a lot to dive into. First, though, to be tongue-in-cheek, not too many historians that I know get their books blurbed or promoted by a president. And that's Bill Clinton has kind of blurbed your book. Obviously, he was president during an instrumental time in U.S. Russian relations, and you've kind of tracked the current moment back to this time. So, just lay out how did you get President Clinton to kind of buy into your book and buy into the project?
I spoke with President Clinton last year. I was able to interview him. And we spoke for about 80 minutes and had a great talk about his presidency, about his friendship with Strobe and U.S. Russia relations. And so I asked him to blurb the book, and he agreed. And I'm grateful that he did it. And it was one of my best interviews. I had a lot of great interviews, but it was great fun. He's a great talker, and he has very precise recollections about his meetings with Boris Yeltsin and his friendship with Strobe, of course. And it was valuable for my book, and grateful I could talk with him.
Well, so Strobe Talbott and Bill Clinton go back to their days in Oxford. Strobe Talbott, though, is, again, the figure at the center of the book, and he is one of these influential State Department journalist types. We've seen a lot of them. You've mentioned a few of them in his own, kind of in this book of yourself, Paul Nitze, Richard Holbrooke, all these names kind of come to the fore. Let's talk about his time as a journalist, though, and 20 years at Time magazine. He's really developing an in-depth knowledge of Russia and of Eastern Europe. Sets him up well for his later career in the State Department. How did that kind of journalistic sensibility, as he says, it was really his only aspiration was journalism, develop in those 20 years at Time magazine?
Yeah, that's a great question. His time as a journalist was crucial for the evolution of his thinking. He wrote several books on arms control and U.S. Russia relations. He gained great expertise. He spoke several languages, Slavic languages. He lived in Yugoslavia in the early 1970s. He traveled to Russia frequently. He interviewed Gorbachev. He wrote books on Reagan and Gorbachev, and he had enormous expertise and detailed knowledge about the nitty-gritties of arms control. He was one of the few journalists who really knew the nitty-gritties of the arms control negotiations, and he knew people and places. And that later on gave him a lot of credibility at the State Department. He gave speeches in Bucharest or in Sofia or in Belgrade when he referred to his earlier experiences. For instance, he had a chance to interview Nicolae Ceausescu, the Romanian dictator, in 1973. He referred to that in a speech at Bucharest University in 1998. So he looked back 25 years and mentioned the the old days when he took a night train from Belgrade to Bucharest to interview Ceausescu the other day, and that gave him a lot of credibility. And later on, when he was, for instance, in Bucharest in '98, he knew the president, Emil Constantinescu. He knew the policymakers. He knew the places. He spoke the languages also. He knew the trouble spots. He knew Bosnia and Kosovo. He had already been there, and that gave him. He knew the history of these conflicts, so that gave him a lot of credibility, I would say. And in terms of arms control, he knew the subjects from his time as a journalist. Again, he knew the SALT negotiations, the START negotiations. He was in close touch with Paul Nitze and had preferred access to Nitze. In fact, Nitze was one of his best sources, and so Talbot had a huge network, knew the languages, knew the places, and that gave him credibility. And this was also a matter of the heart. Like Europe's transformation was a matter of the heart for him, and he knew, of course, French and German, British policymakers. He was a great Finland aficionado and Nordic aficionado. Knew Southern Europe, knew Russia. He was also knowledgeable about India and Pakistan, where he did a lot of nuclear diplomacy and crisis diplomacy. So I always compare him to a Swiss Army knife. He was very versatile. He was a man for all seasons. He was a crisis manager, strategist, architect, not just a theorist, but also a hands-on policymaker, and also not just an academic who knew the theory. He was really a hands-on policymaker, and who could give Clinton valuable advice, because Clinton wanted to be a hands-on president and foreign policymaker himself.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you start off with his days at Yale. He is a third-generation Yale student. He's studying Russian literature. Clearly has kind of like a romantic appreciation for European politics and culture. He goes off to the Rhodes Scholarship with Bill Clinton and a number of other kind of impressive people, where he starts, as I recall from your book, translating Khrushchev's memoirs. So he has that kind of humanistic anchoring, but as he builds this network, especially in the 1980s with Paul Nitze, who's known for being really mathematical in his approach to policy, he seems to really gain a deep appreciation. I think in one of the letters you cite, he says, "Paul, I admire you," as he's working on those books, Deadly Gambit and Master of the Game and the like. So by the time he gets to the Clinton administration or starts advising Clinton, as you kind of lay out, he's been able to marry these two. Talk a little bit about those early days. Clearly, Strobe Talbott and Bill Clinton had been friends. He says that it was kind of a fluke of his career that he ends up in the State Department, because, go figure, Bill Clinton becomes president. But talk about those days of transition. The Cold War is over. Clinton stepping into the Oval Office, occasionally calling Strobe Talbott, showing up at his home in Cleveland Park, so to speak, or not so to speak, actually doing so. How is that relationship kind of recentering on hard policy issues, recentering on the task of governance, rather than just friendly intellectual exchange?
Yeah, Strobe Talbott plays a hugely influential role for Clinton, especially when it comes to Russia. And that's one of the key issues at the outset of Bill Clinton's presidency. When we look back at the Bill and Boris relationship, we may take it for granted, but it was not actually. In the beginning, it was questionable whether Clinton would really meet Yeltsin early on. what later became the Vancouver meeting in April of 1993. And that was a crucial moment early on in Clinton's presidency, when Talbott was one of the few advisors who really advised Clinton to do this. Many other advisors were against it. Warren Christopher, as Secretary of State, was against it. Anthony Lake, as National Security Advisor, was against an early Yeltsin-Clinton meeting. And Strobe Talbott was one of the few advisors who told Clinton, do this, go, reach out to Yeltsin and meet him. We have to support Russia, try to integrate it into the global family of democracies, seizing the moment, using the unique chance to reach out to Yeltsin. And so this was a crucial issue early on, where Clinton really needed Talbott's advice. Bosnia was another crucial issue early on, when Talbott spoke his mind, and in several phone conversations, Clinton, kind of complained about the advice that he got from the Pentagon or from the State Departments. Remember, Bosnia was not part of Talbott's portfolio, but nevertheless, Clinton called Talbott in the evening, asked him about his opinion about Bosnia, and Talbott was in favor of a more muscular approach to Bosnia. He was in favor of bombing the Bosnian Serbs. Actually, he was in favor of putting together a NATO peace force. This was in 1993. Remember, all of these things only happened 2 years later, and Talbott advocated using force and putting in peace troops, and that was not the position of the State Department and the position of the Pentagon. So Talbott always spoke his mind. He told Clinton the things as he saw them. He was straightforward, and of course Clinton would often call him directly in the evenings. And Talbott was a team player, and he always reported the content of these conversations to Warren Christopher, and later on to Madeleine Albright. There was one of his general rules, always to write a memorandum to Albright and to Christopher the very next day, and to inform them about the content of his conversations with Clinton. So he was really a team player, and worked with the Clinton National Security Team. Was also a great mentor to a whole generation of policymakers. Remember, Tony Blinken worked for Strobe Talbott, Eric Edelman, Toria Nuland, Derek Chollet, Rose Gottemoeller, and Bill Burns, who had huge careers later on. And Strobe Talbott mentored them, and really was a team player and sought their input.
So the Bosnia, and you lay this out brilliant in the book, is really a moment where Talbott starts to, it's a moment of danger in some ways. He's negotiating his relationship with the rest of the foreign and defense policy bureaucracies, notably National Security Advisor Anthony Lake, where he has a kind of differing conclusion on what to do in Bosnia. He recognizes it's a sensitive time for NATO allies, and he recognizes the real anxieties in Russia for Yeltsin and the reformers, and say the kind of more kind of hard right, still Soviet-minded, xenophobic kind of cohort of officials that still exist in Russia, and in some way maybe got more of a foothold in the intervening kind of 4 years in the H.W. Bush administration. But he makes his recommendations, and that really sets him up for engagement with Clinton on the issue of NATO expansion and NATO enlargement. We're going to talk a lot about Putin at the end of this conversation, but you're clapping back about Putin's revisionist history on how NATO expansion and enlargement kind of pushed Russia into more aggressive posture that we see today, and ultimately in the invasion of Ukraine. Tell me a little bit about Talbott's role in getting Clinton to see the pitfalls and the promise of one, working with Yeltsin and the reformers, and two, NATO expansion and enlargement?
Yeah, it was a challenge to square the circle and to engage Russia and to open up NATO. That was a constant challenge for Strobe Talbott. To keep Russia on board and to keep Russia integrated and to work with Russia to establish a new sense of NATO-Russia partnership. First of all, in the book, I argue that NATO and that the United States did not want to win bigger after the end of the Cold War. Nobody was triumphant about winning the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. Everyone was working for a soft landing after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Nobody was dancing on the Berlin Wall. Everyone was working for stability and common security, and that's really important to remember. And Clinton and Talbott sort of continued Bush legacy and trying to work for a Europe whole and free and engaging Russia and engaging the former Soviet states. Remember, there were 18 meetings between Clinton and Yeltsin. The United States provided massive economic help. Clinton always went to Russia in times of crisis. He went in 1998 during Russia's economic crisis. He never let Yeltsin down. And one of Clinton's key premises, that's a Clinton quote. He said it in the interview with me, was his approach to Russia was maximizing the positive, minimizing the negative. That was his approach to Russia. Maximizing the positive, minimizing the negative, a process-oriented policy, getting Russia into the G7, getting Russia into the World Trade Organization, getting Russia into the IMF, integrating Russia to the largest extent possible. And a NATO enlargement was never directed against Russia. NATO brought great concessions in the NATO-Russia Founding Act. NATO did not deploy nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe. There was the military dimension of NATO enlargement was quite marginal, actually. NATO renounced the right to deploy troops in Central and Eastern Europe permanently. That was a huge concession. There was very little in terms of military infrastructure in Eastern Europe. These were all major concessions that NATO brought in the process of enlargement. And NATO was not enthusiastic about opening up. You know, I mean, nobody in NATO was enthusiastic about opening up the alliance. The initiative came from the Central and Eastern Europeans, from Polish President Lech Wałęsa, Czech President Václav Havel, and German Defense Minister Volker Rühr. Nobody in Washington was determined to open up NATO in '93. I mean, there was a small group of NATO fast trackers and Ron Asmus from the RAND Cooperation. Some people in the State Department, but it was not a policy priority. It was on the back burner. There were other more pressing issues like Bosnia, like Somalia, like nuclear weapons in Ukraine and in Russia. These were the most pressing issues. NATO enlargement only became a priority later on, and there was also no blueprint actually for opening up NATO, and it was only a gradual and slow process. You know, I mean. It took 10 years for NATO after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It took 10 years to admit the first 3 members after the end of the Cold War. In 1999, NATO took in Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary. So it was slow, it was deliberate, and nobody wanted to defeat Russia. Nobody wanted to win bigger, and there was stability was in the foreground, and that was the priority at the time, I think.
Well, let's talk about one of those priority issues that really brings about or comes at near the end of Strobe Talbott's tenure in the State Department. And that's the Kosovo War. It's a conflict with a lot of different dimensions. Strobe plays a major role in advising Clinton on how to manage this. What were the key moments for that conflict and Strobe's kind of intervention into it?
Yeah, Strobe played a huge role in the Kosovo conflict. He tried to avoid it. The Clinton administration tried to avoid the Kosovo War. NATO was not eager to intervene, not at all. And Strobe traveled to Kosovo repeatedly in 1998 to avoid the conflict and to de-escalate it and to find a solution under which Kosovo would remain in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia but would enjoy more autonomy. That was the aim of his diplomacy in 1998. It did work out. Milosevic escalated the conflict time and again. And then finally, NATO intervened and started its bombing campaign in March 1999. And Strobe's approach was to control the Russian reaction and to make Russia a part of the solution. Not just a part of the problem, but a part of the solution. And that was his approach in 1999. And he played a crucial role in his contacts with Viktor Chernomyrdin and Finnish President Matti Ahtisaari. Initially, the idea was that Vice President Al Gore should play this role with Ahtisaari because there was a Gore and Chernomyrdin because there was this Gore-Chernomyrdin commission, but it was too sensitive because it could endanger Gore's campaign for the presidency. So Talbott took over. Talbott did it, and trying to find a formula under which the Yugoslavs forces would pull out, the refugees would go in, and there would then be a joint NATO-Russia peace force, which became KFOR. So Talbott negotiated for several weeks to find a solution, and he would not go to Kosovo in 1999 or to the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Chernomyrdin and Ahtisaari would do it, representing Russia and the European Union. And finally, it worked, and NATO stopped the bombing. Milosevic withdrew his forces given the NATO bombing campaign, but really there was really a danger that NATO had to wage some sort of a ground war and would be forced to intervene in a ground war. That was a scenario. And the pressure was huge for Talbott. There's YouTube videos at the time when Talbott visits Moscow, pale and red-eyed trips, several weeks of intense negotiations, and so that was a masterclass in diplomacy. And he diffused the India-Pakistani conflict at the same time. In 1999, so I would argue that Talbott even played a more important role in Clinton's second term compared to the first term, because there were more crises in the second term, more crises: Russia's economic crisis, Chechnya, Kosovo, India, Pakistan, compared to the first administration, compared to Somalia or Bosnia. It was even more challenging in the second term.
Well, it seems like it would be nice to have him on hand today with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And I bring that up. You make significant note or pay significant attention to Talbott's estimation of Putin. He met Putin several times. He was perplexed in some ways by his demeanor, his manner of engagement. I believe you said he called him a Jekyll and Hyde. Give me a window into how Strobe Talbott, and by extension maybe some of his kind of allies within the Clinton administration, understood Putin and what Putin might do to the kind of trajectory that Russia was on, and what we've seen played out.
Yeah. Strobe Talbott got a good sense of Putin early on. He saw Putin as a threat, as a potential danger, and he anticipated that Putin could abandon Yeltsin's reform agenda. He saw that early on because Putin flatly lied to Strobe Talbott when they first met in June 1999, when Putin denied that Russian forces would move from Bosnia to Kosovo to occupy Pristina airport. So Putin flatly lied to Talbott. There's a great interview with Strobe Talbott by PBS for the Putin files. I would encourage everyone to check that out and to watch that. And Strobe recalls all of this in great detail. He also recalls it in the Russia hand in his memoirs, but that left a mark that really determined his estimate and his assessment of Putin as a liar, as a paranoid counter-espionage guy, and as a threat for the continuation of Yeltsin's reform legacy. And Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton shared these assessments, and they were all right. The Europeans had sort of a different assessment. The Germans and the French wanted to have a sort of a modernization partnership with the Russians and with Putin, focusing on trade and on economic reforms in Russia, and that's quite stunning at the time when Strobe feels kind of isolated at a G7 meeting in Japan in 2000, when everyone is really eager to work with Putin, and when Strobe issues warnings time and again and wants to discuss Chechnya, and all of the Europeans are really hesitant to do this. So he, at the end of his tenure, he's quite disillusioned and disenchanted about Russia, and there's one, of course, I have one stunning quote from his diaries. There's a conversation with Lennart Meri, with the president of Estonia, in January 2000, when Meri compares Putin to Hitler, and that's quite stunning. Other Eastern European leaders also identified Putin's dangerous sides. There's especially Polish Foreign Minister Bronislaw Geremek, and of course Ukrainian policymakers sensed the dangers of Russia's potential revisionism. Ukraine's President Leonid Kuchma is deeply concerned about the implications of Putin's policy in the near abroad and the implications for Ukraine. That's quite clear from the conversations with Clinton and Strobe Talbott. So there's a great sense of danger about the implications of Putin's policy, especially in the near abroad. Remember, Putin is already toying with a military intervention in Georgia, because Chechen rebels often escape to Georgia, neighboring Georgia, and he's openly admitting this in talks with Talbott and Albright. And Strobe Talbott issues a stern warning in a conversation in December 1999, when Putin is not even president, or not even acting president, instead prime minister. He's already testing the limits. Putin is always testing the limits. How far can he push? How far can he go? How far can he confront the United States? That's really the essence of his policy. That's real continuity. You see him pushing early on, when he's not even president or acting president. So Talbott is one of the first Western policymakers to witness this.
So is that the takeaway that you want readers to gather from your book? I mean, there's so much in here, but distill it down to one takeaway that you want your readers to bring with them.
It's one of the key takeaways. Yeah, Putin was always pushing. Early on, from the start, he's pushing, testing the limits. Another key takeaway is that Russia was never reconciled with the evolution of the post-Cold War system. Russia is never reconciled, and there was no consensus. It was always kind of a modus vivendi. There was no eternal peace. It was always sort of a conditional peace, and conflict and war could always return. When we look back nowadays, sometimes my impression is that a lot of people think the post-Cold War period was a period of stability and of peace. No, it wasn't. We had the Bosnia War, Kosovo War. We had conflicts in the former Soviet space. It was never stable and never really peaceful. We never had this Europe whole and free and at peace. We never had that. It was always a danger of renewed conflict. That was always there. That's a second takeaway, and the third takeaway is that the United States did not want to win bigger and did not want to defeat Russia, and that everyone was eager to help Russia and to integrate it. And so there's no basis actually for this Russian grievance narrative. There's no basis, and there were also no broken promises, because NATO never made a promise not to enlarge. These are the key takeaways, I think.
Well, now I think we've reached our kind of end of the pod, where we get to our hints for history. And we talked about this offline, but what's your hint for history or for scholars studying the past?
Yeah, I would love to see more studies, of course, on the whole issue of NATO enlargement and the transformation of Europe after the end of the Cold War, because we are just in the early stages of research. Mary Sarodi's book, Dan Hamilton's books, Christina Spohr's books, Sergei Radchenko's research, Jim Goldgeier's research. There's a lot of great research going on already, but we need more of this as more and more sources are becoming available on the transformation of post-Cold War Europe. And we also need more research, of course, in terms of Asian security, in terms of China's engagement, China's opening, the role of India and the emergence of India's partnership with the United States after the end of the Cold War. How did that difficult partnership change over time? For instance, with Clinton's visit in India in spring 2000. We need more research about the enlargement of the European Union and the interrelationship with NATO enlargement. We need more research, of course, about Ukraine's role in the post-Cold War system. Why was it challenging to find a place for Ukraine in Europe's security architecture? Why did Ukraine abandon its nuclear weapons? What did it get in return? Mariana Budyarin and others have addressed this issue, but of course we need more research about the later periods, about the Bush and Obama and Biden and Trump presidencies when the sources become available. So we have to really trace the origins of today's conflicts and the instabilities and of course Russia's war in Ukraine. We need more research about the relevance of energy trade, about the relevance of natural gas trade with Russia. Why did Western Europe and especially Germany become so dependent on Russian gas over time?
So clearly there's a lot left to study and a lot to focus on our attention on with so many security challenges facing the world today, and those challenges finding a root in the post-Cold War period. Stephan, thanks so much for having us on for joining us on the podcast today. Once again, to all our listeners out there, please keep an eye out for the release of Securing Peace in Europe, Strobe Talbot, NATO, and Russia After the Cold War. That'll be out with Columbia University Press in September 2025. Thanks a lot, Stephan.
Thanks so much, Anthony, for having me.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.